Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. By now, you should have watched the first video on the homepage, which is called Vietnam Background, and it's just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the events that are leading up to the kind of more heavy U.S. involvement in this conflict. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and pause this video, go to the other one, and come back to this one. Everyone else, I just want to give you a little bit of more information on the conflict and leading up to it, because at the end of class today, we're going to try to answer the question of why fight the Vietnam War. First of all, here's where Vietnam is located. It is in Southeast Asia. You can see from the more close-up map that it does border China to the north. Find Hanoi to the north part of Vietnam. That will come up in today's little notes. And then to the south, you'll see Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be named Saigon. This is Vietnam compared to the U.S. It's like 3 times the size of Tennessee. Next week, when we talk a little bit more about what it was like to fight in Vietnam, we'll learn a little bit more about the weather and the climate. So you should have picked up a packet from the front table. Before your notes start today, I just want to show you some images from the Vietnam War. So this one is a wounded Marine reaching for a fallen comrade. This was taken in 1966. You'll see a lot of images and even footage from the Vietnam War because it was so much more recent in our history than some of the other conflicts that we've talked about. This one is a helicopter evacuating the body of an American paratrooper that was killed in action. This one's also from 1966. These helicopters are actually trying to provide some sort of cover for the troops that are advancing on the ground. So they are U.S. Army helicopters. They're actually pouring machine gun fire into the forest that you see ahead of them. And those are South Vietnamese troops. The U.S. will be allied with South Vietnam during this conflict. Some soldiers listening for updates about the war on the radio. This is the soldiers on the left are wounded and they're waiting for a convoy of like medevac helicopters, pardon, to come in and evacuate them from combat. Similar, this guy with his hands up to the sky, you can tell there's a lot of wounded soldiers here. He's helping to guide a medevac helicopter through that kind of dense foliage. A lot of Vietnam is covered in this jungle, and it's trying to guide them to get help for his comrades. This is the end of the conflict. This is in 1975, and this is a U.S. helicopter and an employee of the CIA helping to evacuate the last of the Americans and some South Vietnamese after South Vietnam concedes to North Vietnam. So, spoiler alert, this is not a conflict that ends in a victory for the United States. This war is going to go on in total, the conflict, for over 20 years in terms of U.S. involvement. And there's going to be a lot of anti-war mentality and protests and demonstrations. There's going to be a whole movement that happens with people writing protest songs and having rallies. And so a lot of the stuff that we'll look at will be involved with that as well. So this woman, this is an anti-Vietnam protest outside of Washington, D.C. They're near the Pentagon, and she's confronting the American National Guard with the flower to kind of show the difference between like war and peace, the weapons versus the flower. This was an anti-war demonstration that unfortunately ended in violence. It took place at Kent State University in Ohio, and the Ohio National Guard ended up firing into the crowd of protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. We'll listen to a famous song written about this called Ohio by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. This is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph, as is this one. So this shows more of the happy side. This is a prisoner of war returning home to his family in 1973. So just like any other war we do in class, let's talk some numbers real quickly. We will have over 8.7 million U.S. troops that serve worldwide throughout the conflict. Over 3.4 million of those serve in Southeast Asia, and over 2.5 million of those serve in South Vietnam specifically. Almost 50,000 American soldiers will die in battle, another 10 not in battle, bringing the total to just under 60,000. At the end of the war in 1975, there were about 2,600 American servicemen listed as either prisoners of war or missing in action. And as of 2 years ago, that number was still 1,600 people unaccounted for. It cost about $200 billion. Worldwide, over 1.3 million military deaths and over 1 million civilian deaths, which should indicate, as we've talked about before, a lot of bombing is going to take place in this war. In fact, it is said that the total tonnage or weight of all the bombs dropped on North Vietnam during the conflict outweighed all the bombs dropped on Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II. So, another quick recap of some of the stuff you learned in the video about how we got to this point in Vietnam. It really goes all the way back to the 1800s. And the French had originally colonized Vietnam in the mid-1800s. It was known as French Indochina. However, during World War II, if you remember, Japan was trying to build this sort of empire. Japan actually invaded and took over Vietnam. However, Japan lost World War II, as you also know, and they end up withdrawing from Vietnam. There was a guy who had been leading the charge to create an independent nation for Vietnam. His name was Ho Chi Minh. So as soon as Japan withdrew from Vietnam, he saw his opportunity to establish Vietnamese independence. So he takes Hanoi to the north and creates an independent state of Vietnam in which he is in charge. Now, the French aren't ready to let go of Vietnam at this point. They come back and they continue to fight against Vietnam for control of the nation. They have Ho Chi Minh claiming an independent state to the north. They have another emperor ruling in the south. And unfortunately for the French, they're defeated in a pretty epic battle. And in 1954, Vietnam's in a place where it kind of has to figure out how to become independent, and France has to sign a peace treaty. So they all meet at the Geneva Conference or Geneva Convention, and they agree that temporarily Vietnam will be split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, the split happening right at the 17th parallel, which is a line of latitude. This should start to sound a little bit like what happened in Korea, by the way. Now, people like Ho Chi Minh did not necessarily want two separate Vietnams. They wanted a unified nation, but we have people that want different things in both areas, so that's part of the problem. Ho Chi Minh is also a communist, which is a problem for the United States in terms of who they are going to side with in this situation. The U.S. does not actually want to sign the peace treaty that takes place at the Geneva Conference because they're worried that Ho Chi Minh and the communists would win a general election. They see that in the foreseeable future, communism is going to take over Vietnam. Because if Vietnam holds an election to reunify 2 years after this, Ho Chi Minh's a popular guy, and we do not want Vietnam to fall to communism. So the guy that's ruling in South Vietnam, his name is Diem, and the U.S. is going to initially give him their support because he's not communist. However, he pretty quickly turns out to be a pretty bad guy and a pretty bad leader for South Vietnam. He is very intolerant of people practicing other religions. He's a Catholic himself, and he especially dislikes the Buddhists that are living in Vietnam, of which there were a pretty good amount at the time. He starts to discriminate against them, even persecute Buddhists. and he starts losing popularity pretty quickly. He cancels elections, he's taking away people's rights, and the political situation in South Vietnam pretty quickly turns contentious. A lot of people are unhappy, and a lot of people are starting to turn to Ho Chi Minh to the north to be a potential leader. Since Diem is so unpopular and he's pushing people to follow the communist leader Ho Chi Minh, the United States has to do something about this. So they encourage and actually help to overthrow and assassinate Diem on November 1st, 1963. Now, this doesn't necessarily help the political situation in South Vietnam at the time, because now it's still unknown and it's a little bit chaotic, and we still have more people turning to communism in the north. Interestingly enough, and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, Diem's assassination comes only 3 weeks before John F. Kennedy's assassination back in the United States. So Lyndon B. Johnson is going to be taking over and inheriting this conflict in Vietnam. As more and more people start supporting communism in the North, the North Vietnamese set up a series of underground tunnels and trails to start smuggling in weapons, and these will become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trails, and we'll look at a map of these next week and talk about them a little bit more. Now we have North Vietnam arming themselves against the South, South arming themselves against the North, and what we have is a similar conflict to what we had in Korea, with the South fighting for more of a democratic state of government and the North fighting under the Communist Party. So at this point, when we talk about these major conflicts, there should be questions that are being raised in our minds. So I'm going to give you a chance to write down a couple of questions, and then we wrote an inquiry question for you today to work on. So if you turn your page on the back of the notes, there's a place to write two different kinds of questions. One of them is a research inquiry question, and the other one is a debatable inquiry question. Something for research is a pretty broad, open-ended question. It's going to lead you to a lot of different sources to help find probably many different answers, many different ways of answering the question. So it could be something very general about the war, maybe not the Vietnam War specifically even, but it should be open-ended. It should ask you to think. Your debatable question, this is one that there could be a yes or no answer, but it requires support and justification, and it is a question that we could have a debate about. Think about the questions we've debated in class, or look at the back of the room at the essential question, which is debatable. Should powerful countries impose their ideologies on weaker countries? We can answer yes or no, but we still need to give a lot of support for that. That's a good one that recurs over time as well. So take a few moments, write your two inquiry questions. When your group is ready to go, I want you to share those out in your group. So pause the video for now. After you've shared out, come on back and I'll tell you the next steps for the day. All right, welcome back. You should have shared out your inquiry questions. Here's the one we are sharing with you today to write down: why fight the Vietnam War? So today is all about perspectives, and the idea that if we ask the question, why fight the Vietnam War, to these four different guys who I'll introduce you to in a moment, we are probably going to get four different answers depending on their perspective, depending on their experience, depending on their bias, and depending on their view of the situation. So we have four documents we're going to look at to answer this question today, and we're going to split this up and then share out in our table groups. So here's what this means. Document A, this is from Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, top left picture. Everything's on PSL, by the way, Module 13, Lesson 1 page. You'll find the documents. So on your desk, if you have John F. Kennedy or Georgia O'Keeffe, you are going to be working on Document A, Ho Chi Minh. If you are Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, you are going to be working on Document B, which is from John Foster Dulles. He was the United States Secretary of State at the time, deals a lot in foreign policy. That's your bottom left picture. If you are Cesar Chavez or Jackie Robinson, you will be working on document C. That is Dwight Eisenhower, U.S. President at the beginning of this conflict, top right picture. And if you are Eleanor Roosevelt or Amelia Earhart, you are working on document D, which is from Diem, the leader in South Vietnam that the U.S. helped to eventually overthrow and assassinate. If you look at the chart that is in your packet, you are first sourcing the document. Then, of course, you need to read it. So I want you to write down some bullet points of what you know about the author's background that's going to impact or influence their perspective. After the video and after today's notes, you should be able to get a couple of bullet points about each of these people in that section. Then, after reading, you're going to write down their major points or arguments, and then how they would answer the question, why fight the Vietnam War? When your group is ready, you're going to take turns sharing out. Everyone needs to take notes while people are sharing. By the end of class, you should have filled out the entire chart for all 4 documents. Now, if your table's missing somebody, you can either work on that one together or you can work on it on your own. Again, you want this finished before the end of class. If it's not, that's on you. You are going to see these documents again on Friday's quiz. If you get finished early, your options are to work on that Module 13 vocab, or you can review for Friday's quiz. All the review info is on the Module 13 page. So good luck. Tomorrow we're going to look at the incident that brought us more officially into this war. And then, of course, Friday is your quiz. So have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.